Okay, we're about 5 minutes away from Ali's talk, so we're going to have to put a pause on the PlayStation 5 conversation for a minute, and let's get Ali to, hello Ali, let's get him to tell us a little bit about what we can expect.
Hello everyone. So this talk is about exposing your D code to be used from Python or any other language for that matter, because this talk will give the details of how to have a C library interface. And because Python and most other languages know how to talk to C interfaces, we will be able to use it from Python. There are a number of issues there, starting with extern C, how it helps with name mangling and other linkage issues, all the way through how to have an object-oriented design with your functions and an opaque struct, things like that. Okay, allow me to add one more thing. This talk is my second talk on this conference, and it's only because you said we didn't have enough talks. So I just taught quickly and remembered my good friend, our local D programmer from eBay, John Degenhard, had told me, oh, that seems to be a good conference topic, Ali, because I told him in 2 minutes what I was working on. So these conference topics are everywhere. I was just talking to friends on the DConf last night, and whoever you talk, people have ideas that they think are not conference worthy. Just as soon as you think it's worthy, there's some seed of information there, you start building up your slides, and then you realize I can't even fit it in an hour. There's so much that you can put. So I encourage everyone, please, you have great ideas. Please bring them up on conferences.
Yes, please do. And especially when we put out the call for talks at DConf every year and the next DConf Online, you know, I'm always worried I'm, you know, coming up to the end of the deadline that because, you know, a lot of people get them in late and the pool of talks to select from isn't always as big as we would like. And I know, you know, our community isn't so big that hangs out in the forums and stuff like that. But I think you don't have to be shy about this stuff. If you know anything about D project at your job or in your spare time, or if there's anything that you know about D that other people might not, like in Ali's talk yesterday, I mean, that kind of stuff makes good material for talks. So that's good advice, Ali. A lot of this talk is about actually not Python, but about C and the interface to C, yes. And that's a topic that's near and dear to my heart with my bindings. And I've got the series on the blog that I write about. How much of your D life involves interfacing with C?
None anymore. And I agree with Walter where he said C should go away already because of its safety concerns and because what the humanity paid for those unsafe features. And nobody should start any project in C unless they really, really have to. Maybe their environment is so constrained and that the libraries they have. C++ could be a candidate because we use that in production, but still my D programs are command line utilities. However, because they were so much faster than Python alternative, we felt compelled to expose this library part to Python so Python could call in and take advantage of that fast parts of the tool.
What this talk is about is exposing a D API via C interface to D. But that's the only way you're using the C interface these days, yeah?
Yes, that's the only reason I use the C. There are other ways of exposing to Python, one of which is autowrap, which I will mention in my talk. And the other one is we have direct Python bindings, but I wanted to have a library. And even though I told you that we're not using it from C or C++, the library has an example program for anyone who is compelled enough to use it from their own C or C++ tool.
How much of your code base is Python at your company?
Only tools, only evaluation part of it. So this project is about autonomous driving. The vehicle code, the code that drives the vehicle, is all in C++. That's a certified language. It's in a certain version of C++ is certified, and that's the only thing driving the safe code can use. Most of the evaluation code base, most of the tools around that are in Python. I heard we have some other languages around too, but it's mostly a C++ and Python shop. So I solved this particular ROS bag migration issue with D, and that's how we got involved with D. We got stuck with D, let's say. That one migration program evolved into 7 programs now, all sharing the same underlying ROS bag interfacing layer. and 7 libraries, 7 programs using that library. And it's because it's capable and does so much. Now I've exposed this one part of the library to Python. I'm in the process of exposing another parts to Python as well, because all these evaluation tools will be able to use our D side functionality.
You don't talk much about the Python side in this talk. There's, you talk about how to integrate it at the end, but I'm wondering, are there any issues in Python, interfacing Python and D, that are different from issues interfacing Python and C, D and C? Or is it the same sort of issues you have to be aware of in C?
That's a very good question. And let me tell you, there are other ways of attaching yourself to Python infrastructure. Python comes with a C API. And what you can do is you can write a Python extension. And that was my goal to begin with. Writing Python extension means you become part of Python almost, and you can introduce all these new features to it, which requires making calls into the C API, which requires to grab that infamous global interpreter lock of Python, GIL. So once you do that, you have to do this Python extension only on one of your threads, because only one of them can grab it. And suddenly you realize you're not faster than Python anymore. And of course, it sounds like I'm blaming only GIL for this, but no, if you're gonna create objects through C API, if you're gonna create Python types through the C API, you can beat Python just a little bit, because Python side is already using the same API behind the scenes. So that was one approach I've tried, and I gave up, to be honest, because of not seeing much performance gain, but also getting lost in C API problems with Python. There are inconsistencies. You need to read which one holds a reference to an object, which of the C API functions, which one doesn't. These inconsistencies are solved in different versions of Python. You have to be careful about that. So once I saw there was nothing, I stopped it and just exposed a pure C API to where it mattered. Why the D side is fast, in my case, is not because of D's bit twiddling speed or low level speed. It's only because I use these ROSBAG files the way they were supposed to. I take advantage of some domain knowledge. I look at the structure of the format of a bag file and don't do unnecessary stuff, because it's actually designed very well. You can touch only bits and pieces of the file that you actually need. Python side open source ROSBAG libraries don't do this. They just eagerly read stuff to be consumed later on, but not every use case needs that stuff. So my speed up comes from domain knowledge more than pure D speed in this application.
Do you guys use any other scripting languages there, or is it Python your main go-to?
The continuous integration uses Groovy, like very specific languages. Python is our language.
Yeah, I see. I like how you went into the name mangling thing. There's a lot of people who these days coming into D without the background in C or C++, where this kind of knowledge becomes applicable about name mangling and overloading and linking and everything else. And it's the first thing you talk about here. I've never discussed this in any of my C blogs or anything like that. In your interactions with new D programmers, and I know you're talking to them a lot, what do you find is the most common issue in this missing background that we're seeing, people coming from Node.js or whatever?
To be honest, I don't really interact much other than our forums. I don't have a personal email much with them. I'm active on the D meetup community, the D community, which is very, very small. Yes, I mean, it's understandable. People coming from different languages don't have what C and C++ forced us to learn. So
Right.
that was their values, I guess. You need to know them at certain things at bit level. You need to face some linking issues to appreciate what name mangling is.
Well, the point my muddled mind is trying to get at here, it's a product of the times, right? It's a sign of the times. I mean, if you go back 20 years ago when D was first starting, you could expect that anybody coming to D had some knowledge or some exposure to C, was vaguely familiar at least with what an object file was and this kind of thing. And so our entire documentation, tutorial infrastructure, our entire knowledge base is oriented toward those people with that assumption. I wrote my book with that assumption. Yeah. So when people come in today, they don't have the resources explaining these things that we assume they already know. So if all you know is Node.js, then you have no idea what the difference between COF and OMF is. You know, I mean, that's going to be foreign language to you. And your talk here, you actually, you know, accommodate for that somewhere. I don't know if you did it intentionally, thinking about those, you know, that sort of background.
When I realized when I write something, you know, I have the free book Programming in D. When I wrote any chapter, the flow of information was so important. So before talking about anything, I assumed the reader didn't know anything. So I had to go down and talk about something else first, and then something else first. The extern C, why should I blindly put extern C on a function interface? Because it's not alone. You don't need to put it extern C only. You need to take care of function overloading as well if you put that. So why is that needed? That's the need. A flow of information coming without leaving any gaps or without jumping forward was the reason for me to touch on anything.
I see.
And also, I don't talk about anything unless it's related in this flow.
Right, I see.
That's what I learned when writing my chapters.
So you're not thinking necessarily about your target audience, but about how the information flows to them.
But at the same time, if I think this way, it becomes accessible to
A
people
broader
who are not
audience.
experienced in it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's boring for experienced people.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the audience isn't your primary motivation, is what I'm saying. It's the
Yes,
flow. Yeah,
yeah.
right. We have a question here in the video chat box. I don't understand the motivation, talking about exposing your library to Python via the C API. Why do you need to expose through a C API if autowrap already does it? Is it how autowrap does it, or is this another approach?
Two reasons. Autowrap came to my understanding a little late. I didn't start this one late, but it came late. So it's not something I knew for years that I could consider. And also, our D code base has 0 outside dependencies, even though autowrap is written by Attila Neves to be considered as one of extension to D ecosystem. I didn't want any external dependency. Also, I don't want to say this, it's so simple to do it, what I did anyway. It's one short file, as I will show in this talk. But as I have a slide for it, use autowrap if it works for me. For me, there's no real reason.
What would you think is the first thing we ought to be teaching people if we were going to add some stuff to, say, the D-Lang tour? Okay, before you even start talking about Hello World and D, what do you think is the most important thing that they would have to know about the tooling or anything like that?
I think it should come from the need. Unless they need it, unless they need to program at that level, who cares? They don't care. But people who need to do low-level stuff like that, they will have to learn that, and there are resources for it. But it's not for the general D programmer to be concerned at that level. I have a colleague at work who I respect a lot, who knows a lot about system programming too, or on the system level at Linux environment, C++ programmer, hardcore. And I was surprised he was not strong on bit manipulation, casting, shifting, how to convert things at that level. So strong, but never had to do anything at that level. So unless you need it, I don't know how, and I don't think we should force it either.
You know, I agree with you almost 100% most of the time. This time I'm going to have to disagree with you just a little bit. I think it's pretty critical to understand the concept of the object files and the linker. And I say this because, you know, I spend a lot of time in Discord these days lurking. Every once in a while I'll pop up with an answer to somebody's question. But I notice there seems to be some confusion. You know, people will get a linker error and talk about it failed to compile. And they're trying to figure out why it won't compile. You have to know the difference between linking and compiling, when the link step happens, what's happening, you know, what's being generated. I think that is a fundamental thing to use the tools properly and solve your issues.
One of the reasons is nobody sees the linker.
Yeah.
It's hidden. There's no link step at all. I just say compile, and I usually have a .d single one, and I think it's a compiled. Yeah, that's the reason I think. I agree with you too. Yeah.
No, thank you. We have a question from the live stream chat. Ali, you mentioned that currently C and C++ are the only choices for the automotive industry as they are certified. Do you know what the certification process is like? What can D do to get certified?
I asked the same question. It's not a technical issue, it's money issue. I heard if you pay $500 per line, you can certify anything. but I don't know the details. I'm assuming it comes with certain guarantees that you must follow these guidelines. There are AutoZar and other automotive industry coding styles. There must be the equivalent of it for D. As long as you apply this standard guideline, then we certify you for using DMD, whatever version. So there's no technical reason. There is money and interest reason.
A lot of what you do in the D community is educational. What's the motivation for that?
First of all, I'm learning myself. Even though people look, I'm a conference speaker, I must know a lot. No, I don't. On every single conference talk, there is something someone corrects, someone points out, and we're all learning. So I see myself as a learner to begin with. That's why I'm on the Learn forums. And there must be some reward for answering somebody's question in some way. So we're all there. That's why we're sharing this. We're all social animals. Plus, early on in my life, I realized that, maybe mistakenly, but I realized that there was certain quality maybe in me that I saw but others didn't. I did not only understand something, I understood how I understood it. I could see two people talking, not miscommunicating. And I would just jump in, please tell him this, then it will connect the thoughts there. So maybe that's why I'm interested in understanding, learning, maybe also explaining. This all comes together.
Do you believe that there's something more that we can do on the dling.org website to bring people in without them crashing? You know what I mean? To help ease them into the language better than what we're doing now?
Okay, a difficult question. First of all, the quick answer is, as you and I talked yesterday, we're waiting for your video tutorials because the world seems to be moving towards video teaching.
Right.
Small, short snapshots. Even though we discussed, some people like me and perhaps you, we want to go to text and quickly browse and extract the information we need. I don't know. Our tour is very good. Everything is in there, but in some places it's also for experienced programmers. Yeah, I agree with that, but I don't know to make it easier. I think it comes from the need. People must need to know something. Once they are motivated that way, they will find the information, I think.
You're actually talking about no throw on the slide that's up that I'm looking at right now. I wrote an article on gamedev.net many years ago about how to handle exceptions in callbacks in C, and I recommended catching it, and if I remember correctly, catching it and storing it in a variable and then picking it back up again on the D side, because there was no guarantee that it would propagate through the C code. What has been your experience on that, interfacing with Python?
This works. There's no bad experience, but I started with the knowledge that exceptions cannot travel through other runtimes. You can't do this. So I started with that knowledge. That's why I had to wrap every call in a tried block like that. I've known this from C++, exceptions not translating to D. But again, let's mention autowrap. Autowrap does this exception translation from D to Python automatically. So everybody should use it if you can. Yeah, I think what's interesting in this talk is having to catch error. I think that's very interesting. Error, you shouldn't catch error, but if I don't, I can't even report anything.
Right, and that's what I recommended in my article at the time. But there were some people who commented on the article, and I don't remember the details, but I think on Linux it's possible for the exception to propagate through. In some situations, in some implementations, it can probably. I'd have to go back and look at the comments, but because it's not guaranteed, you can't rely on it.
The other situation in my talk yesterday is multi-threading.
Oh,
you
right.
have a concurrency worker. That worker, if it dies with error, you have no idea, none. It's gone, and your main thread has no idea. Catching error and just printing something, or transferring that knowledge to the main thread is, I think, very, very useful and productive.
We've got a follow-up question on the certification thing. Does the D specification hurt its prospects in the, quote, safe industries where lives are at stake? It's not particularly thorough in quite a few places.
I would agree with it. I'm not experienced enough to comment on that aspect, but I can tell you exceptions are no in C++, so that would have to be with D as well. But yes, I would have to agree. Yeah, you can't leave a specification questionable parts in the specification. Nobody will certify it in that state.
But how many people can document the spec in our community? Beyond Walter, who knows enough about the spec to make sure that all the holes are filled?
Yeah, there are some people actually. Some people always come up on the forums saying, this spec piece is wrong. You know, it says this, but this works. So some people are looking at it, I assume. There was that Brian Schatz.
He did a lot of work because of the DCD. Do you have any coding standards for D at your company?
No, no. Just one programmer so far. And also just 2 or 3 people who review the code who understand enough to look at the code.
I see.
But it's me only, no standard.
Yeah. Do you have any standards for any of the languages you're using, or?
Oh yes, very heavy for the C++ side.
Of course.
Automatically checked.
The other D shops, the actual, where they're actually using D primarily, I haven't heard anything about standards. Have you?
No.
I guess if anybody's using standards, they're just using the Phobos standard, probably.
That's actually something very interesting. In my C++ life, doing some things the best way was always a topic. Maybe Herb Sutter contributed with his Guru of the Week things. A question, and how do you do this? This is better. Even to the point where it doesn't matter, like the const keyword, west const or east const. Everything is sliced and diced, and there's always the better way of doing this, and people should follow the guidelines. And you can see this in C++ core guidelines. There are more than 400 guidelines in there that you're supposed to know and follow. This is strikingly different in the D world. Maybe that's why it brings up the engineering part of D for me from my yesterday's talk. Just go to the result, whatever works for you. So that's a very different community. Mm-hmm. Maybe the times have changed. I know C++ from 15 years ago. Maybe it's like this these days too. But that's a very big difference, striking difference, refreshing difference for me. Mm. Instead of robotically following guidelines, learning, oh yeah, in this case, I wasn't supposed to put this here and that and this. It's just write it, solve your problem.
I'm looking at the slide about argument lifetimes. This struck me the first time I saw it, fromStringz.idup. Why not toString?
That would work too, of course.
Because I always use toString. It didn't occur to me to use idup. And I'm wondering if there's any difference.
Yeah. There's a reason, because I was consulting the C interface, D's C interface page on dlang.org, mm-hmm. and there's an idup on there. That's probably why my mind picked that up.
I see. Yeah.
And of course, idup is a little cheaper probably because you don't have to import the conv module.
Right.
Studconv. Not something I would care, but that's one difference there.
Have you encountered any issues between GC and the foreign code?
Yes. The initialization of the runtime, mm-hmm. I didn't have it initially. The second programmer at my company who actually just wrote his first D layer, that's why I'm hopeful we're going to expand D, he had the same issue. And he also had to expose D to Python, basically doing almost what I did, but rewriting the same ROSBAC parsing, and boom, Ali, what's happening here? I mean, as soon as I'm in this loop doing this from this thread, this happens. Ooh, looks like a garbage collector bug. Of course, it always looks like a garbage collector bug. And then if I set the array length beforehand to this, it doesn't happen, okay? Oh, of course, you're not initializing the runtime. So that's such an important point, which I already had forgotten. I also had issues, not necessarily from interfacing with Python, but my destructors referencing already destroyed objects. So destructors can be tricky if you especially mix with structs and classes. I can't tell you which order.
Yeah, well, yeah. It's because we conflate destruction and finalization is what you're getting to, yes.
So I had all those issues, and the program runs just fine. I make some improvement, and then I receive this bug report. But I must tell you, I don't think it's my experience in programming, but it's D that reduces bugs so much. There was one killer bug, one bad bug, my bug. For optimization purposes, I was reusing a buffer, but I was forgetting to initialize an object on that buffer. So I had to call construct or put a .init of that thing on that buffer. I was forgetting it, so I was using the old state from whoever populated that buffer before. Other than that one, I can't remember any serious issue in these 7 programs running for 2 years now. They just help. And that's what I meant yesterday with productive. You're not fighting bugs. You get to results. You get your programs, computer doing what you want.
How do you debug a Python extension?
gdb-args, and then Python 3, and then your Python program. I think GDB can open the whole process.
I see. Okay. All right.
I think I've done this, yeah.
Okay.
Actually, the same colleague that I mentioned who wasn't comfortable with bit manipulation is the person who taught me this. So gdb-args works. So we learn from each other all the time.
Yes, we do. With the Python C API, they still have a lot of reference counting, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And do you have a lot of raw pointers that you're dealing with?
Yes, it's all raw pointers. They have a C API header file, or they have a set of header files. So the normal thing for a D programmer would do is to find a C API binding. And there may exist some of them on our code repo. Maybe they are somewhat old or not. Maybe they work with a certain version of C API. But when you look at it, at certain bindings, it's huge, it's complete. Yesterday, I attended Adam Rupi's live coding session, and he showed something that I do exactly the same way. Why am I supposed to bring the entire binding family of all the functions to this end? I look at the header file, 1 struct, and 3 functions that I need only. I just copy paste and write my own binding to talk to that. That's all. And then I realized, wait a minute, I didn't have any dictionary support for Python. 12 more. So I pick and choose everything to this side, and I agree. This is not what other people talk. I think they would get a pre-cooked something, and which will work on most cases. But once you do it your own, you own that code. You know exactly what's happening. So yes, writing those bindings, I had to deal with raw pointers because everything works around pointers to these reference counted objects. So you need to call explicitly increment ref, decrement ref for a Python C API.
Do you wrap the Python API behind a safer D interface?
Yes. Let's say I started doing it. I wrote these functions that automatically did the structs around those raw bindings that came from Python side. Yes, I had my structs where to increment the ref count, decrement the ref count. Everything was working correctly. But as I mentioned earlier, I abandoned that part of the project because of getting scared that I was getting reference counts wrong in certain functions because of API inconsistencies, let's say. And I found references to this in the Python community on the forums. It's not only me complaining about this. And also, as I said, being a proper C extension was not giving me the performance needs. So I abandoned that part of the project. So this way, I'm only producing a raw C API, and the Python uses it with its own methods of wrapping. As we will see later on, it's the C types that I use. There are many ways of doing this, actually. I used C types because it came natural. It was simple enough.
Should we be, in general, wrapping C bindings? We make our direct C bindings and then build a wrapper on top of them to present a safer D interface instead of using them directly.
This was answered by others on the forum, the question, and I agree with them. First, a pure C binding. Exactly like what the header file has. And then, if you want, a wrapper around that one to make it use it safely or exception safely, let's say. RAI type that take care of reference.
Well, you say if you want, but my question is, should it be like a standard thing that we do?
Yes, 2 layers. But yeah, it should be 2 layers. Or what you mean is perhaps don't even expose the lower level.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to expose it to some degree, yeah. So, I mean, I guess, what I'm thinking is, I put out these raw C bindings to SDL and, OpenGL and whatever. I have seen other people put out bindings with a wrapper to go with it. And that seems to me like a lot of work, and I'm thinking, well, should that be what we're all doing? Should I, in bind BC, have wrap BC to go with it? And more memory safety is what we're moving toward. And what does that do for the future of our C APIs? And that whole fiasco about at safe by default, whether C function bindings should be safe or not by default. So this is a question I think that we're going to have to confront.
As discussed yesterday, I'm not someone who's involved in these discussions much. So I passed that safe discussion, the improvement proposal mostly. And at some point when we started making fun of, with the pictures and mimes, I got interested and I enjoyed it a lot. myself. And I was on the criticizing side when I read that part of the discussion. I had the chance to talk to Walter through email about this. And then Walter, once again, convinced me that he was right. For practical reasons, to make at safe default for your D code, you have to accept safe default for even unknown functions. Attila doesn't agree with this. Other people don't agree with this. But again, very much in sync with my talk yesterday, practicality. You know, if it's going to give me some safety, 90%, I'm willing to pay that risk as long as I can control it, of course. So Walter is the strongest engineer I've met, probably. Whatever he decides, says, no matter how ridiculous it sounds initially, it's the right one eventually. Or maybe he's a good salesperson, so convinces you somehow.
Okay, we had Walter talking about memory safety. We had Attila talking about memory safety. The next talk following yours is about trusted. Going back to the wrapper concept, do you, from the D code, the parts of the Python API that you have to use, do you see any room for safe interfaces, trusted interfaces? Would you be motivated to do that?
I ignored the whole topic.
For now.
Apologies.
Yes, for now.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you see yourself? I mean, that's where we're going. I mean, D in the future is going to be about, you know, just judicious application of safe and trusted. So, do you see yourself ever applying that to your API here?
Probably. To be honest, even the no throw keyword is not on my actual code.
Ah.
I put it on this one.
Okay.
Because, you know, it's a little, maybe I'm the single programmer, that's why. Because all 5, or in my case, maybe 7 functions that I exposed, all of them in a tried block, I know it's no throw. And again, because the no throw came up on the forums, I said, okay, let's not leave no throw out of the presentation. So I put them on the slide examples. Of course, I compiled everything, it works, but that's where I am. Maybe I should be more careful, maybe. Or, you know, there's a pull between automatic inference of attributes versus programmer putting them on. In some cases, you think, why am I doing it? But at a language interface, yes, you have to. The other side can't know.
When you were implementing this, was there anything that surprised you? Something that didn't work as expected or worked differently as from expected? I ask because I remember when I first ran into, in the OpenGL API, there's a pretty common function for when you're initializing shaders that takes a const char star. And I ran into issues getting a pointer to the immutable string. Yes. So you got to work around that. And that was a surprising thing the first time I encountered it. So did you ever encounter anything like that implementing this?
Yes. You need to translate it a little bit. Our const something is different on the other side. You need to translate a little.
Yeah.
There wasn't an ugly cast though. The function interface takes care of it beautifully, because once you go across language barrier, linker doesn't know anything. One side declares it one way, you define it the other way, everything just works. Actually, while preparing this talk, and I asked this on the forums, the talk passes arrays as a length and the pointer to first element pair explicitly. But if you take this as a D slice on your D side function, it just works automatically. Because the way the D slice is nothing different from that. But it's, of course, this is cheating. It'll work only in one platform or one library, in your one case. The D API doesn't really guarantee how it's passed. And I thank the people who answered that question on the forums. So that's why I said, let's be explicit. Even the ref keyword, initially on the D side, I take as a ref an element, not as a pointer, and it works.
Yes.
C side passes a pointer, you take ref, and it works.
Yes,
I said, yeah.
I wrote about that not too long ago on the blog in one of the C articles, and it's about arrays with C and how it all boils down to the pointer. In some cases, you actually have to use ref for like static arrays. You can't just pass a static array by that. You have to use ref or pointer.
Oh, of course, yeah. Do we remove star LR?
So I guess he was talking about your line range example, and so they're asking for clarification.
Let me see what I have. GC remove root LR. Oh, yes, of course.
Star LR.
Yeah, no, because in this case, the destructor receives an LR pointer. Yeah, there's a one-level dereferencing difference there. When you construct, we receive a pointer to pointer. But when we destruct, we receive just a pointer because that's the handle. Yes, I add root dereferencing, but when removing, no, it should be LR. I'm standing my ground on this one. This is where I talk about no automatic error management in the Go programming language. So, we are programmers, and by definition, what we do is to use the computer for our repetitive tasks. So if I do something repetitive in a language, if I have to, there's something wrong. So the language is going against its primary goal of helping you reduce the repetitive actions. This is why I like D, and even C in this case, because I can write a macro to simplify certain things. And not every language gives you this power. I'm on the crate, so I think that's the wrong choice in that case. Simple is good, as Attila said today in the keynote. We all agree with it, but it shouldn't come at the expense of some reasonable automation, let's say. So I'm a strong supporter of the D language. I like it.
Comment here, nice macros.
So I learned this at Riverbed, which had a C library written almost like object orientation. Everything was object oriented in C, and everything followed those macros. Once you wrote a function, the line of expression, the next line would be bail error. So that would check whether the error code was there. In some cases, it would be bail null, because some functions returned null as an error checker or something didn't work. Everything followed the same finally. They called it something else, but I like calling it finally, that every resource cleanup happened at the end of the function. There were a few guidelines that you had to follow. When it's a loop, inside the loop, you had to allocate and deallocate. That was a little different, but that's how it should be in C. Otherwise, you can't find your safe way through C code. You must follow this kind of resource management, I learned. And that library also had huge use of macros to implement containers of array-based containers, linked lists, trees, but it was a complete mess in C to find what is defined where. If it worked, it was great. If it not, everything was macro generated basically, but it worked. That was good. That's where I learned these macros. So I give credit to Riverbed and their contracted engineers, because they had them to write them. I will make a comment on this slide, which I already make in the talk.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Let me underline it. If you look there's an underscore fields underscore member of a status class, Python class. I spent hours on this one. And I was so desperate. It didn't work. I'm going to criticize Python here a little bit, because I would expect a little better error reporting from Python to tell me, dude, there is no underscore fields underscore of your struct. Because I was typing double underscores at the front and end of it. So I spent hours for mistyping, misreading something from their spec documentation, C-types documentation. And all I got was a very underlying library,
Foreign Function Interface, FFI.
Yes, from that layer, I was getting something wrong kind of error. But something should tell me you're using in this way, but you're missing this crucial fields member. Or maybe, I don't know, there should be some help saying there are no fields in this one, or maybe there need not be. Anyway, I spent hours and I blame others for this.
One of the common things I hear in the D community is that D ruins C++ or C for, people who used to like them. And I'm wondering, do you have any issues in context switching between D and Python?
No, I don't write Python code actually. When I need to, which I wrote, so when I exposed this library, I wrote a bag Python class, which is one-to-one equivalent of the open source bag class. I wrote that, but I copy pasted and then removed all the guts and called my C API libraries from that class. No, I think I understand Python enough to, there's no big difference. I have my likes and dislikes about Python.
So is there anything you want to say to kind of close out the talk here as it's finishing up?
I will say the same things. Use autowrap, as others commented. Jan Hönig commented about it. Why even do this? Don't do this. This is just an educational presentation to show you what is involved behind the scenes.
Ali, I know it's probably not your thing, and that's why I challenge you to make a presentation on using third-party libraries via Dub. Do you accept the challenge?
Okay. I'm challenged. Next DConf Online, I have 1 year to learn.
There you go. There you go. I understand FFI is done through C as it works as portable lowest common denominator, but wouldn't it be easier to interface with languages that provide high-level semantics?
No, it's actually harder. C is a very easy language to interface to. It doesn't have any complicated semantics.
I want to answer Jan Hoenig's question. Was all the work worth it instead of using autowrap? Is having autowrap as a dependency really that bad? No, it's not that bad. Use autowrap. If I had known autowrap earlier, if I had some experience of it, I probably would have used it. But there is also some value, in doing your thing yourself. Now I know everything about this at every point. But at the same time, I didn't write Phobos. I use Phobos too. So I'm conflicted in this answer, but that's the answer. I didn't know autowrap to begin with. Maybe I had it in the corner of my mind. It came last year, January, February timeframe, if I'm not mistaken. Or maybe the blogs were written at that time by Attila.
And there was a follow-up to the FFI. On that note, how does C++ FFI compare to C FFI?
It's actually fairly similar. The main difference is the name mangling, and one complication is C++ has a different notion of plain old data than D does, because C++ has copy constructors and D has postblit. So there's a little bit of an impedance mismatch there, and the POD definition kind of determines how the parameters are passed. So it is important, and C++ has actually a fairly complex definition of POD, and it's a little difficult on the D end to line up with that because some things are just not in D that are in C++. So you have some issues with that. You have some other issues with overloading in that there's some problems we finally did solve that longs have different sizes depending on what C++ compiler you're using, and so it would change the name mangling, and the name mangling when long is 32 bits is different from the int name mangling, but D doesn't have that notion of having two ints that are the same size. So there's kind of a hack in the compiler with a special kind of struct to use that it recognizes and says, oh, he really means the long name mangling for this. So yes, it's more complicated, and there's a couple of tricky things to it. The C interface is really simple. That's why I said it's the easiest one to take care of. It doesn't have any name mangling things.
I have a question to Walter.
All right, about the DLLs, right?
Oh yeah, that one first.
Yeah.
Is Windows DLL support good, Walter?
I haven't looked at it in a long time. It used to be good, and then people would modify D runtime and it would stop working again. And this has happened repeatedly. I can't say with certainty what the current state of it is.
There is a bounty on improving Windows DLL support, so there are some outstanding issues. Hopefully one day somebody claims the bounty.
My other question
had an issue with how exports work. That I agreed with his solution, but he was going to work on it, and then I don't think anything happened. So yeah, we're a little deficient in that.
You mentioned postblit. Now we have copy constructors as well. Do you have any comments there?
The comment really is we're going to move away from postblit and towards copy constructors, and there's also a dip in the queue to do perfect forwarding, which kind of adjusts the semantics with all those things so that you can do perfect forwarding. It's a rather complicated dip. It should bring us much significantly more compatible with the way C++ does things. The perfect forwarding is a feature people really want, so we'll see how well that works. It isn't perfect, but I think the dip gets us mostly where we want to be with that. So yeah, postblit is obsolete now. We tried to make it work. Andrei and I and Razvan all tried for a long time to make postblit work, and it just had some corner cases that were frustratingly difficult to get right, and we finally thought, well, let's just abandon it and go with copy constructors. So postblit isn't going to get any more improvements from now on. It's just going to be there for backwards compatibility, but for new code, you should use copy constructors. Postblit was a great idea. I'm sorry it didn't work out.
Yeah, I really liked the whole idea. Move automatically, awesome. But then, does it interact from the behind the scenes if you have a copy constructor or not? Do you think it's safe, or will it sneak up on you when you don't expect?
Do you think what's safe for you?
Like I have a struct design without knowing postblit is executing. Then I add a copy constructor, yeah. Or maybe I change something, now postblit does something. Will it gonna come in unnoticed?
So will postblit and copy constructors conflict with each other? Is that what you're asking?
I think so, or...
Well, they work together, no. The idea is you just get an error if you have a postblit and try to add a copy constructor. So there's not going to be any thing ugly happening under the scenes. It's just not going to compile. Because nobody really understands what the semantics should be if you have a postblit or a copy constructor, and there doesn't seem any reason to have both, so it's just going to give you an error.
All right, and thank you very much, Ali, for your time and your talk,
everyone.
and we'll see you around, man.
Yes, thank you, Ali.